Good morning, members. This is the appointed time, and we have a quorum. First item on the agenda, a confirmation of minutes of meeting. The minutes of the meeting held on the 2nd of February 2015 have been forwarded to members. The Secretariat has not received any proposed amendments. I'd like to invite members to endorse and confirm the minutes of the meeting. Thank you. Item 2. Information papers issued since the last meeting. After the 16th of February 2015, the Secretariat issued 2 information papers, the title of which have been set out in the agenda. Any questions? No? Item 3. Items for discussion at the next meeting. The regular meeting of the panel will be held on the 27th of April 2015, 10:45 a.m. The administration has proposed to discuss the following 2 items. Number 1, guidelines and documents prepared by the Competition Commission as required under the Competition Ordinance. And number 2, prices of auto fuel and domestic liquefied petroleum gas, LPG. Any questions? Do we agree? All right. It is agreed. Item 4. Long-term arrangements for the operation of the Peak Tramway. So let's invite the administration in first. Thank you. Good morning, Secretary. The administration is proposed to amend the Peak Tramway Ordinance Cap 265 to provide for the granting of future operating rights commencing on and after the 1st of January 2016 and the legal basis for other longer-term arrangements of Peak Tramway operation. And also to discuss the continued provision of Peak Tramway service by the company for a 10-year period commencing the 1st of January 2016. So may I welcome representatives of the administration and Professor, please walk us through the paper. Thank you, Chairman. Members may recall that in 2013, we briefed panel members on the 2-stage approach to be adopted by the government on the amendment to the Peak Tramway Ordinance and the long-term arrangement. We completed the first stage in 2013. We amended the ordinance in order to grant a 2-year interim operating right to the Peak Tramway Company Limited, PTC. It will expire this year, and we will proceed with the 2nd stage exercise, so that after expiry of the 2-year interim operating right, the PTC may continue its operation. And we're here today to brief the panel on the 2nd stage legislative amendment exercise, the legal framework, and how we're going to deal with the operating right for the 10-year period commencing the 1st of January 2016. The legislative amendment exercise seeks to address the views expressed 2 years ago. First of all, there will be a need to improve Peak Tramway service and facilities, and also to increase the capacity of tramcars and to make better queuing arrangements at the Garden Road terminus. And secondly, there will be a need to put in place a mechanism to allow the operating right to change hands smoothly from one operator to another where necessary. On improving service and facilities, in 2013, the PTC expressed to the government that there will be a heavy investment of $600 million to redevelop the 2 terminus and also to increase tramcar capacity. Now, the government has looked into the proposal. We find this preliminarily viable. The PTC is preparing for the detailed consultancy study required in the 2nd stage. The legislative amendment will also include an exit mechanism, which is to deal with the handling of essential assets, terminus sites, and premises, so that in the event of the PTC ceasing its operation, the sites and premises and assets will continue to be utilized by the new operator. And it will also set out a clear framework. First of all, the Chief Executive in Council may grant up to a maximum of 10 years the operating right to the future operating right to the operator, and that the operating right may be extended for one further period of not exceeding 10 years. That is to say, the total period of an operating right could be up to 20 years. However, for this extension to be granted, the operator must, within specified time frame, submit information on its upgrading plan to the government, so that the government has to be satisfied with its commitment and ability to undertake the upgrading plan to enhance the facilities, improve the service of the Peak Tramway. Once the legislative exercise is passed, the exit mechanism can be put in place immediately. In relation to the 10-year operating right commencing the 1st of January 2016, we propose to start discussing with the PTC, considering that the PTC has also indicated a new development plan to the government, and a 20-year operating right would make the upgrading plan financially viable. And this is, in our view, the right direction. And secondly, in view of the good track record of the PTC in terms of service quality and safety performance over the years, we also consider that the Peak Tramway is one of the internationally recognized icons of Hong Kong. And the PTC has long been the operator of the Peak Tramway service. It also is the owner of the 2 terminus sites and other essential assets. And it has already indicated its interest to extend the 10-year operating right on expiry of the first operating right period. And if the right is granted through tendering, in relation to the 10-year operating right commencing 2016, the tendering exercise can only commence after the second stage legislative amendment exercise. It would take time to complete. It may also involve transfer of assets. If PTC, the current operator and owner of the terminus sites, related premises, and other assets of the Peak Tramway cannot provide service during the interim period when untendering is underway, Peak Tramway service may need to be suspended. Yet, if PTC can have the operating right commencing the 1st of January 2016 of 10 years, then disruption to the service can be avoided. And by then, the PTC may, in accordance with the law, submit a financially viable plan to the government that has been scrutinized to extend the operating right further by 10 years, that is altogether 20 years. In the 1980s, the government also adopted the same approach, that is 10-year plus 10-year manner, in granting the operating right, according to the legal provisions at the time. And this legislative amendment exercise merely adopts the same approach. But the same starting point is that any new operating right should be granted in light of public interest. Therefore, when discussing with the PTC, we'll strive to get the best terms and conditions. And there will also be a mechanism under the new legislative arrangement to introduce new operators. Although the interim operating rights will expire at the end of this year, we could avoid the situation of being put in disadvantageous bargaining position. And in fact, since the 1980s, the Peak Tramway has become an essentially tourism and recreational facility. And we believe that the overseeing bureau should be changed. And therefore, in this legislative exercise, amendment exercise, we're going to amend the definition of secretary from Secretary for Transport and Housing to Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development. Chairman, we urge members to support our proposal on the granting of future operating right for the coming 10 years. And we're going to submit a bill in May 2015 to LegCo.
Okay, it's now time for members to ask questions. The first one is Wong Kok Heng, followed by Deng Ka-pil, Chair Wei-chun, Chen Ka-lok, Sin Chung Kai, Chen Ka-lam, and Yu Si-wen. Any other members who want to ask questions? Each person will have 4 minutes. Wong Kok Heng first. Thank you, Chairman. As an elected councillor on the Hong Kong Island, I'm very much concerned about the arrangement for waiting at the fair for the Peak Tramways. That's why I'd like to ask the Secretary, that is at the 2 termini of the Peak Tramways. I noticed that you said you'll be satisfied with the arrangements in future for the waiting time. But what do you mean? Now at the entrance point, of the terminus on Garden Road, whether it's raining or shiny, tourists and other visitors are very dissatisfied with the long queues. So what sort of arrangement we have in the future to avoid people caught in rain or under scorching sun when they're waiting? Have you got any idea about, proper arrangements in the future after the company gets a 10-year extension of the operating right? And secondly, even though the administration regards this as a tourism facility, if the fair, though, is not effectively regulated, then giving them a total of 20 years of operating right, would that result in the fact that the fare would just go up as much as the operator likes? If there's no control of the fares, even though it is a tourism facility, it still could lead to some chain effects. Its profits, of course, need to be reasonable, and yet its profits need to be put under control. 10 plus 10 years of operation means very long-term operation period. So we need to have effective regulation put in place. Secretary? Chairman? Well, on the first question, on the 2 termini, as Mr. Wong said, the people waiting in the queue actually are caught in the rain or, got very hot under the sun. So that's why we've asked the PTC to come up with expansion and improvement plans. As I said, the company does intend to invest of about $600 million to expand and renovate the 2 termini. So in the future, there should be better arrangements for waiting. So based on our proposal put forward to you today, later on, we will begin a negotiation with PTC. And then we'll actually discuss the arrangement details with them. As for the fares, it's not that now, but since the 1980s, in the last century, the administration then had positioned Peak Tramways as a non-necessary means of transportation. Therefore, the transport policy then was that the fare would not be put under control. And this policy does not apply only to tramways, but also to other non-public transportation. But the operator will be monitored by the market. That is, they will be subject to the demand and supply in the market. And in our negotiation with the company, we will actually consider the basis on which we charge the premium. So that's what we'll be concerned about. Secretary, can you arrange for us to have an on-site visit? Well, I think we are making that sort of arrangement already. We'll let members know. Once the date has been set, you can sign up for the on-site visit. Yes, it would be better for us to go there on-site and maybe get in touch with the company in person. Yes, as for safety and waiting time, I think it will be something worthwhile for us to actually find out more about through an on-site visit. Next one. Okay. Well, you're saying that you would actually put safety first? And the historical value of the tram to Hong Kong is also important. Yet economically, well, the paper says in the past 2 years, when the operating right was given an extension, there's a payment of premium. But what about your future mechanism for premium in future? Have you reached an agreement on the sum with them, or is that the premium is supposed to be readjusted every 2 years? As a tourism project, you still have to have some sort of economic analysis, before we actually give out $6 million. And what is the income to the government? In the past 2 years, we know that the government got $25 million in profit. But what about the contribution of the facility to the Hong Kong tourism sector? There's no mention of that in the paper. And also, since we cannot control the fare, we should urge the company to offer some sort of incentives to potential passengers. For example, offering 1 or 2 days a month free tram service to elderly people in Hong Kong. Can we do that? Could you sort of ask the PTC to offer some sort of incentives or privileges to elderly people? Well, safety is our top priority. The Hong Kong Electrical and Mechanical Engineering Department will monitor safety. But as for the premium, members may recall that at our last meeting, or at the Bills Committee, we did explain that the approach adopted long ago actually is that, for the long term, for the arrangement for long-term operating right, we can review whether we should stick to the previous approach or we should offer a new one. Internally, the administration, including the Lands Department, are looking into the best way ahead. We have yet to enter into negotiation with PTC. So it really depends very much on whether the amendment bill will be passed. But the administration plans to hire financial consultants to assess what's the best way to negotiate. As Mr. Tenkapil just said, well, whether we should consider the company's actual profits. So that's something for us to consider. As for sort of fair concessions, as I said, policy-wise, we will not regulate the fares. But I believe that PTC should be aware of the views expressed by the public. It currently offers some concessions. Yes, a free ride a year on a day for disabled people. So whether they could offer similar concessions to elderly people, we can express that to the company as well. Chair Wei-Chin next. Of course, we do hope to retain the peak tramway. We do hope that the service can be continued smoothly. But I'm just worried about the negotiation between it and the government. Will the government have enough bargaining chips? In fact, the PTC owns the terminal and has the relevant buildings and other facilities needed. The assets involved. Just then, the Secretary said that we cannot control the fares. But I also feel that As mentioned in the paper, paragraph 11, there's a chance that if the operator does not do a good enough job, then you can bring in other investors or competitors. So I think the public will be most concerned about fares, even though it's a tourist facility, some people will use it as a means of public transport. So say if the fares are very high, can the administration bring in other operators? Legally, can you oblige that is the company should offer or rent out its facilities at what levels to other people? Just the Secretary said that the peak tramways is regarded as a tourism recreation facility. So it's not really under the Bureau's control. Is that the government's policy? Or is it that in the future, if there's any public transportation that is used for tourism means, then, like, for example, the tram or the route that goes to Disneyland, would that be controlled by the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau instead? I think as an economic project, we did discuss it before, but Secretary, could you reply first? Yes, just then Mr. Chair mentioned about the bargaining chips we have in the negotiation with PTC. But we don't want to enter into negotiation in a negative atmosphere. But actually, we can come up with some conditions. And if the PTC cannot fulfill those conditions, if our negotiation breaks down, what can we do? If a proposed amendment bill is passed, then that would allow for the creation of an exit mechanism. That is, if the negotiation breaks down, we will invite for tenders. Of course, will that be the chance of termination of service, or that possibility exists? And our legislation will require that should there be a chance of exit and bring in a new operator, then we can require that. Of course, the two terminali will be owned by the PTC, but other facilities and tracks are not owned by the company. So then they will be forced to rent out the space to the new operator, and the facilities to the new operator as well. As for fares, as I said earlier on, the government's policy is it will not regulate the fares of non-public transportation, like shuttle buses or village buses. If we regulate the fares of tramways, then that would be a big change in our policy, implying that we need to regulate the fares of other public transport. That's not the direction we should get into. But how we can ensure that the tramway company would listen to public views on fares? So I think we can ask the company to come to our bills committee meeting later on. Next one is Kenneth Chen. Thank you, Chairman. I'm concerned with not just with the continuation of the operating right of the company, but also that because of the change in the legislation in the paper, it mentions the exit mechanism. I've got some questions here and concern as well. That is, in case the government decides ultimately to find another operator instead, the government says with the amendment bill, it will ask the existing company to rent out or even sell its assets to the new operator.
So I think this is a bit unclear because according to the paper, the assets at the two terminal sites belong to the operator, and how can the government compel the owner to mandatorily sell or lease the assets to the new operator? We need to be very clear. And there is also a concern whether this will be a contravention of Article 105 of the Basic Law Protection of Private Property, because it is said that the government can acquire assets from private owners with compensation. Now, if you require the owner of the two terminus sites to lease the site and the premises? Well, this is a rather tricky legal question. I hope the Secretary can answer me. Well, these are practical questions from Dr. Kenneth Chan. Now, at present, the two terminus sites are owned by the PTC. Of course, we cannot compel or mandate the PTC to sell them. As for the tram cars, well, they are the assets of the PTC. Now, in this legislative amendment exercise, what we're proposing is that should there be a change of ownership or operator, we cannot compel the sale of the assets because the hefty sum to be paid will deter new operators from joining the industry. So we're going to impose a mandatory lease arrangement, and any disputes over the rent or sum will be subject to arbitration by the Lands Tribunal. Now, tram cars will be sold to the new operator. Of course, the PTC must accept these terms and conditions if it is granted a 10-year operating right. And of course, our colleagues in the DOJ would scrutinize the proposal very carefully. But let's imagine if we grant an operating right and without an exit mechanism, this will be very unreasonable. So we need to strike a balance. And I think the PTC will understand that with the exit mechanism and the future operating right, they need to come up with practical arrangements, and we'll discuss the details with them. Well, I understand that we all have chips as far as negotiation or bargaining is concerned. For example, there may be mandatory lease or sale arrangements, and I sincerely urge the government to consider very carefully these legal issues, because we don't want to see mistakes like happened in the past to happen again. And the government should also draw reference from other similar operations like the Longping 360. So in this legislative amendment exercise, the government should also look into other provisions to avoid any conflicts and not to disappoint everyone. All right, this is a comment. Mr. Sin Chung Kai. Chairman, I wanted to ask the question asked by Dr. Chen as well, because mandatory sale arrangement, well, is a contravention of protection of private property in Article 105 of the Basic Law. What about mandatory lease arrangement? If there are disputes, you could be judicially challenged. However, you cannot, before the amendment is passed, seek advice from the CFA. So, is there any difficulty? Well, as far as the law is concerned, we must be clear that there is no prejudice nor contravention to the Basic Law, and the DOJ colleagues will be very careful in drafting the amendment. Now, as far as the public transport franchise rights are concerned, say public or franchise buses, the similar difficulty will be encountered. For example, when the operators change, the bus fleet will have to be transferred. Now, this could be a historical problem. The two terminus sites are owned by the operator. The operator bought it a long time ago. So, if negotiation fails, there is no incentive for the owner to lease out the two sites to the new operator. But of course, if the tramway service continues, the value of the two terminus sites will be higher. So there may be an incentive, but my understanding is that for franchise buses, all the termini belongs to the government. But now, what is special in this case is that the terminal sites do not belong to the government. Well, strictly speaking, these sites are granted on leases, termed leases. But let's say if this is considered a factor such that we have no handover arrangement, then that would mean that de facto perpetuity for the operator. Well, Secretary, can you succinctly reply to Mr. Sin's question? For the new operating right or the new contract, an agreement has to be reached between the two parties. Now, under the new contract, if the PTC is a party to this contract, then when it ceases operation, the terminus sites will have to be leased out to the new operator. So this will be put in the contract as a condition, so as to compel the lease arrangement. Well, on legal advice, I'll defer to my colleague to take your question, but we understand that there is such a request in this council, and therefore we have this exit arrangement. Mr. Andy Chen. Well, this is a practical issue that has to be dealt with. That is why in the past 2 years, during the interim period, we looked into great details of this legal arrangement of the sites with the DOJ colleagues and the PTC, and we've decided to deal with the issue by way of the arrangement as set out in the paper. That is to say, the government will be empowered by the provisions to mandate the sale of essential assets and lease of the terminal sites. And the DOJ has looked carefully into the legal aspect of things and find no problem. And with the Council's support, we will begin discussion with the PTC on the 10-year operating right commencing next year. Now, on the mandatory sale or lease arrangement, well, this is a very complex issue, and should there be handover of ownership, well, there will be detailed provisions on handover arrangements between one operator and another. And the PTC also understands the legislative proposal proposed by the government, and it is agreeable to the proposal. Well, in fact, according to the existing provisions, the government has the right to acquire land as long as suitable compensation is paid. But in this case, we have a clear owner with a clear ownership of the two sites, and that is why we're proposing to deal with that in this specific manner. And there is also the arbitration mechanism, is that right? Well, when the Bills Committee is set up in the future, Secretary, please prepare the DOJ's legal advice for our reference. Mr. Chen Kam Lam. Thank you, Chairman. Well, there'll be an arbitration mechanism in the exit mechanism in the future. Yet we're still concerned that ultimately the arbitration outcome will be challenged by way of judicial review. Even if the Department of Justice finds no problem with the proposal, there may be different views in the community, so we have to be very careful in considering that. Because if we have mandatory sale of land and mandatory leasing of or mandatory sale of assets and mandatory lease of sites, then ultimately the result may be the same. If the rent under the mandatory lease arrangement cannot be agreed, then the new operator is still barred from entry. Or if the rent is not set at a fixed level under the mandatory lease arrangement, the new operator may be deterred from submitting their bid. So I think the best way is to mandate sale of sites and assets. If the operator fails to provide satisfactory service, the government should have the right to resume land owned by the operator, and that should be flexibility. I think the government should consider how to strike this balance. And will the government consider another approach? Let's say any plan B. Let's say we construct a new peak tramway connecting the peak to other parts of the district, be it a kind of public transport facility or tourism facility. Is it possible? Because on the one hand, there'll be competition in the market. On the other hand, you could avoid this complex land ownership issue. Secretary, well, let me take your first question. Whether there is any space for a new peak tramway track. I don't think it's quite possible because we have some historical reasons, as you can see in the paper. The peak tramway started its operation since 1888. It was constructed by the company, and in the early days it served as a kind of public transport, and since the 1980s, because of other forms of public transport available, the positioning of the peak tramway has changed. So although the site is owned by the government, the property or the assets are actually owned by the PTC, but it doesn't mean that we have no alternative. I don't think it is quite fair to say that. And we have this exit mechanism that on the one hand doesn't contravene the law, and on the other hand doesn't impact upon the interests of the existing operator. And this is the consideration for striking a balance. I think the impact will be even more severe than a mandatory sale or lease arrangement. And if the land premium is high, it may be an entry barrier to the new operator, and the exit mechanism may not function effectively. Of course, the exit mechanism may not be triggered, but we still need to consider the legal aspect. Mr. Yu Siwing, sorry, the first question hasn't been answered. First question on whether arbitration outcome will be challenged by way of judicial review. The Department of Justice, during the 2-year interim period, conducted some research, and the DOJ will explain things very carefully and in great detail when the Bills Committee is set up. All right, so the question has been answered. All the questions, including the comments made by Mr. Chen, will be forwarded to the DOJ, who will explain to us, the Bills Committee. Mr. Yu Siwing. Well, on the operating rights, the operator will be granted a 10-year operating right, and there'll be a $600 million investment to expand and redevelop the terminuses. And I'm concerned about the terminus at Garden Road. It is short of space, and I understand the PTC has adopted some temporary arrangement for or waiting arrangement elsewhere. I don't know in terms of the superstructure whether the government will offer any help.
You can still increase the height. Would you help them? To get the application done to government department to raise the height, to provide shelter for people waiting in the queue. You talk about a long-term operation period here. And secondly, about point 8, government says that in the future, the Transport and Housing Bureau will be actually replaced by the Commerce and Economic Development Bureau when it comes to overlooking the tram service. Now we seems to be in a transitional period, but when will the new bureau take over oversight of the operations? And I do advocate a speedy change because this is a tourism project. 99% of the people traveling on the tram are tourists. If the operations continue to be under the jurisdiction of the Transport and Housing Bureau, then I think there might not be enough resources available. Do you have a timetable? 2 questions. On your second question, I think in the bill we'll propose that the future secretary will refer to the Secretary for Commerce and Economic Development. That is, once the amendment bill is passed, it will become effective. The government is inclined towards doing that. Internally, within the administration, we will be well prepared for the transfer of responsibility from one bureau to another. I will ask my colleague to supplement later on, but also, if we were to ask the existing operator, that is PTC, to thoroughly expand and come up with ways to improve the situation at the terminus, in terms of improving people's waiting time. Well, I think it all depends on whether they think there's a chance for them to continue to operate first. I'll ask Mr. Chen to supplement. Mr. Yu's concern is, you can see on Garden Road, often you can see long queues at the tram terminus. I think through coordination of various government departments, the situation has improved. The queue has moved towards the area of the Hong Kong Squash Center. And depending on the transport situation, tramway staff can lead the potential passengers to cross the street to get on the tram. And this will actually reduce the chance of being caught in the rain or being right under the sun. And if the PTC is to be given the operating right for another 10 years, then it will implement the improvement plan. That is, those who now, or the area where people are in the queues will be reserved for queuing only. And the platform will be the entire terminus will be extended towards the direction of the tram. So there'll be passengers who will be able to wait in an air-conditioned area. So this extension plan is feasible to us because we can see that while increasing passenger capacity, it also has a great benefit in terms of improving the queuing situation. Okay, next one, Mr. Yik Chi-ming. I'm concerned about the mandatory lease and sell issue, but other members have asked the question. But I think Mr. Yu asked a good question as well. That is, if the PTC is to be given the right to operate for another 20 years, then can we sort of do some, elevation at the site? That is, I often sometimes go on to the tram. I can see long queues on the outside of terminus, I know there's an emergency access EVA before you go to the peak shopping mall. I know that areas belongs to the government. It's necessary. Can we, set up some temporary shelter to keep people from being caught in the rain? Secretary, yes. If there are any facilities that the PTC thinks can implement without having to wait for the continuation of the operation, right, of course they will go ahead with that. But for elevation or expansion or upgrading or expansion of the Garden Road terminus, I think as an operator, PTC would like to know what the chances are for them to continue to operate in 10 years before they go ahead with the 600 million investment plan at the terminal. I'm sure during the Bills Committee's meeting, if necessary, we can invite PTC people to come and share their plans with you. And definitely we would liaise with the PTC in our negotiation and to express to them the views of the tourism sector. Of course, I understand. If necessary, they can apply, for what they need. But I think if the PTC can negotiate with the government earlier and get the help they need from the government, then that would actually speed things up. Secretary, any supplements? No. Okay, we'll definitely try to do the negotiation well with them. Okay, Paul Chair. Well, all along, Peak Tramway is an important tourism facility. Historically, it is something that we should not stop anyway. But I've got two questions. Time-wise, the paper hasn't told us clearly. Under the current arrangement, if the amendment bill is not passed in time, and under the existing legislation, then how can the administration approve the operating right? Would it be on a bi-yearly basis? And just then we discussed the mandatory lease and sale of assets. I think it's mentioned in the paper that if there's to be mandatory lease or sale of assets, then the entrance threshold may be too high for potential takers. So has the government got any idea of the value of the land? And if the government is to buy the land and resell it to or rent it to potential operators, then what are the figures involved? How much money we're talking about? Secretary, on your first question, that is by the end of this year, if the 2-year interim operating right expires and the new amendment bill has yet to be passed, then the consequence will be that after the end of this year, there'll be no operator. The operator would not be able to operate the service. But to ensure the continuity of the service, then of course, depending on LegCo's views, we could bring in a temporary amendment to the law to allow for temporary operation. But LegCo has to agree to that. As for mandatory lease and sale of assets, I think during the Bills Committee stage, we can further explain. That is whether there will be any conflicts with the principles of fairness. As for mandatory sale and lease, whether the government asks the operator to return the assets to the government, we would not favor doing things that way, because that would actually trigger concern from other owners of other rights. But the existing operator, talking about operating a site in Central, the cost would not be high, of the land would not be high, and so there may not be any potential new operator, who feel that there are enough incentives for them. But I'm very aware that, about members concerned about the legal consequences of monetary release, and so hopefully we can look into this in more detail during the bills committee stage. Lands Department staff, do you have any information on that? Well, this is the current operator is a private company, but has the government done any estimate? Lands Department, any supplement? I think if necessary, we can assess the value of any piece of land if there's a need to. Sorry, I just want to find out more about, lastly, if you have to go on the path of monetary release and sell, and to stop the threshold from being too high to potential investors, what can the government do? I think the government should be prepared for various options instead of having to pass an amendment in the last minute to continue the service. You need to be prepared for various options first. Okay, Chairman, just supplement it, Mr. Chen. Just that Mr. Chair mentioned that he's worried that the term service may be continued, but now the monetary release and sale provision in the law will guarantee that the term service will not be discontinued because of change in the operating rights. So that is, in other words, even if there is monetary sale and lease, as long as the government has the right to own the land, then the term service will be continued. Any transfer of right, may lead to some sort of arguments. So when we begin the negotiation, we would indeed discuss in detail original agreement with the PTC on the actual arrangements for exit mechanism. For example, who should pay for the last month of water bill, things like that. So whether it's lease or sale, the operating right of the tram service will not be discontinued. It's only during the handover period there could be some technical issues that need to be resolved, but we can address that in our negotiation. Thank you. Pokaki, you raise your hand, but I think we've drawn a line, so because we have another important item today, I think I'll just wrap up this item after I ask my question. Secretary, just then members asked questions about safety and continued extension of the operating right by 10 and another 10 years. So will the investors be concerned about the future operating? After the first 10 years, you have to see whether you're satisfied before the additional 10-year period will be granted. Just then, Wang Kong-hing mentions like passenger safety needs to be a concern, and there should be more sheltered area for waiting. So given the time involved, can the operator discuss with you how much they can invest beforehand? When, during the 10-year period, can they discuss with you about their future investment plan? I think we need to make that very clear. And members are also concerned about safety. There is really not much space there, very little space indeed. Even if there were to be a sheltered area for waiting, it may not be safe because so many tour buses driving to the terminus. So do you think you can have some extension internally? But, there still could be issues. So hopefully, Secretary, I hope you can try to reach a proper agreement with the PTC. So it's better to make things clear before, getting into arguments in the future. Tram service, undoubtedly, is an important tourism facility. We need to maintain its high-quality service. In terms of operation or marketing, if it's done well, then this could be beneficial to the tourism industry in Hong Kong. So how would you negotiate with the PTC? Okay, Chairman, I think you mentioned concern about safety. It's not so much about the tram service itself, but the safety of people waiting, at the terminus. So definitely that's important to us, and we have to ensure that safety is ensured there. PTC subjectively wants to have the operating right renewed for 10 years after 10 years. If it's possible under the law for the PTC to get the operating right in the first 10 years, then it will go ahead with the 600 million investment plan.
咁佢都希望盡早咧。
And they'd like to implement as soon as possible upgrading plans for facilities and the termini. All right, I think we should wrap up discussion of this item. May I ask members if we agree? I'm sorry. You agree, right? You agree to the government's plan to submit the bill to LegCo and also to start discussion on the operating right commencing 2016. All right, today's meeting is quite long, so I'll take a 5-minute break now so that we can begin the next session and finish discussion in one go. Raise your hand and let me note your name, jot down your names first.